The room reeked of victory before the war had even begun. The scent of burning resin from the ceremonial war torches mixed with the sterile chill of the high command chamber, the air thick with the smug confidence of those who had never tasted a real fight. Vaen Soral stood at the edge of the gathering, his mandibles tightening as he observed the spectacle unfolding before him. This was not a war council. It was a celebration. The admirals, high strategists, and fleet commanders of the Galactic Coalition basked in their own certainty, their ornate uniforms polished to a dull gleam under the flickering light of the laser plasma displays suspended around the chamber. The human territories will fall within the first 3 cycles. Admiral Aurek, a towering brute with a carapace scarred from ceremonial duels rather than actual combat, tapped his claw against the glowing map of Sol. The digital projection bathed his features in crimson. Their defensive stations are laughable. Their fleets are scattered. We will crush them before they understand what's happening. A ripple of amusement spread through the room. Vaen's hands clenched behind his back, his claws pressing into his palm. They had no idea. "They don't need to understand what's happening," Vaen murmured, his voice sandpaper over rust. "They only need to survive long enough to turn the battlefield into something you've never seen before." Silence. The air shifted, an unspoken challenge hanging between him and the War Council. Admiral Aurek turned, his narrow eyes gleaming with condescension. "Ah, our resident prophet of doom speaks again." He gestured toward Vaen with an exaggerated wave of his clawed hand. "Perhaps you'd like to regale us with another of your human myths." The laughter that followed was not cruel, but worse. It was dismissive. Vaen did not laugh. Instead, he stepped forward, his gait slow, deliberate. He had fought wars before, not simulations, not border skirmishes with lesser species. Real wars, the kind that left ghosts in your mind long after the last shot had been fired. The kind the Coalition had never faced because they always fought from a position of strength, dictating the rules, ensuring the enemy never had the chance to surprise them. Humans did not fight like that. They never had the luxury. "You think I fear them?" Vaen asked, letting his voice coil through the silence like a creeping fog. "I don't, but you should." The chamber doors slid open with a hiss, and a junior officer stepped in, his breathing labored. The metallic taste of unease drifted into the room. "My lords," the officer stammered, eyes flicking between the admirals. "The first fleets are departing. The order has been given. The war begins within the hour." Admiral Aurek exhaled sharply, dismissing the officer with a lazy flick of his wrist. Then he turned back to Vaen, a predatory smirk tugging at the edges of his mandibles. "See? The future doesn't belong to ghosts, Vaen," Aurek said. "It belongs to those with the power to shape it." Vaen's stare was a storm before the first crack of thunder. He leaned in, voice low enough that only Aurek could hear. "The future belongs to those who survive it." Aurek's smirk faltered for half a second. Then the fleet launched. The invasion begins. The Coalition's warships punched through the void like a storm front, sleek behemoths with armor that swallowed starlight and bristled with planetary-scale artillery. The bridge of the flagship Icarus pulsed with an eerie glow from the heads-up displays, the control panels humming beneath the fingers of the officers manning them. Fleet Master Corin watched the advancing formation from the command dais, his posture that of a sculpted war statue. "Maintain speed, full forward shields, target their orbital defenses." The first barrage slammed into Earth's outermost stations with brutal efficiency. The defense grid fractured, outposts collapsing into fiery debris as ships buckled under the concentrated onslaught. A sea of wreckage tumbled in slow motion through the blackness. The command bridge erupted in cheers. Officers clapped armored fists against their chests in salute. Corin allowed himself a satisfied nod. It was exactly as the strategists had predicted. Human resistance was scattered, uncoordinated. If this was the best they had to offer, then— "Fleet Master," a voice cut through the euphoria, sharp with unease. "There's movement near the debris field." Corin frowned. The sensors flickered, distorted by the interference from the wreckage. The shards of destroyed stations drifted aimlessly, yet something about them felt wrong. Then it happened. The wreckage came alive. What had appeared to be the broken husks of shattered defenses suddenly shifted course with purpose. Corin barely had time to process the realization before the first explosion erupted. The wreckage was not just wreckage, it was bait. Old orbital platforms, once thought destroyed, suddenly powered up from hibernation, firing rail cannons and high-velocity projectiles at point-blank range. Coalition ships erupted into fireballs. The cheers turned to chaos. What? How did they— One of the officers spun toward Corin, his eyes wide. Corin's stomach coiled into a knot of cold dread. The humans had let them inside their defenses on purpose. A high-pitched alarm screeched through the bridge. More debris surged forward, not on random trajectories, but deliberate attack vectors. Automated assault drones welded into the husks of dead ships, activated with ruthless precision. Missiles streaked from what should have been harmless floating wrecks. Explosions rippled through the fleet. The perfect formation collapsed into panic. Corin's heart pounded against his ribs as realization settled over him like a weight too heavy to lift. This wasn't a desperate defense. This was a trap Vaen Soral had tried to warn them about. He turned to his comms officer. "Get me the High Command, now." The officer paled. "Sir, we've lost communication with half the fleet." Corin felt the cold breath of something he had never known before. Fear. He turned toward the laser plasma display, where the projection of Earth loomed like a predator watching its prey struggle in its grip, and for the first time since this war had begun, he understood the truth. They hadn't invaded a weak, scattered enemy. They had walked straight into the jaws of something far worse. Corin gripped the edge of the command dais, his claws digging into the reinforced alloy as the Akaris lurched from another explosion. The impact shuddered through the ship's hull, a deep vibration rattling through his bones, leaving a sour weight in his chest. Across the bridge, the laser plasma displays flickered, struggling to maintain coherence as chaotic sensor readings streamed in. "Report!" His voice cut through the tangled sounds of alarms and shouted orders. An officer spun toward him, his mandibles clicking in barely restrained panic. "We've lost Vorkan's spear and Tyvanus. Half the outer formation is compromised." His eyes flicked between the static-laden feeds. "We can't lock onto the attackers. They're moving inside the debris fields." Corin exhaled sharply, trying to suppress the creeping sense of something slipping beyond his control. He turned to the display, trying to make sense of the nightmare unfolding. Wreckage, or what had looked like wreckage, had already gutted some of the Coalition's finest warships. The dead drift of human outposts and shattered hulls had concealed something far worse. Repurposed weapon platforms, dormant until the fleet was deep inside the field. Now, the battleground was nothing but burning fragments, a graveyard coming alive with a hunter's patience. "Adjust firing patterns. Clear the debris with wide-radius bombardments, Corin ordered, keeping his voice measured. The weapons officer hesitated. Fleetmaster, some of those fragments, they have life signs. Then they're not debris, are they? Corin snapped. Fire. Outside, the starless void ignited with lances of plasma and kinetic bursts, the shock waves rippling outward, sending wreckage tumbling into unpredictable spirals. The fleet opened fire, trying to turn the battlefield back into something familiar, but the enemy never let them. The wreckage fought back. Out of the chaos, once motionless husks pivoted, revealing their true nature. Torpedo hatches disguised as hull fractures snapped open. Railgun ports glowed with the charge of artificial thunder. Corin barely had time to react before the retaliation struck. The next barrage was not a desperate counterattack, it was execution. Coalition ships in the lead formation were sliced apart with terrifying efficiency. The second wave met fields of electromagnetic distortion that twisted their targeting systems into gibberish. Automated assault drones, the size of a fighter but armed with payloads designed for capital ships, swarmed out of the dead metal. They moved with the erratic grace of predators testing their prey. Corin watched one drone spiral through the defensive barrage, weaving through gaps too small for a piloted craft. It latched onto the hull of the Dravath, then detonated. The ship's spine snapped like brittle stone, a wave of cascading explosions devouring it from within. The feed on the heads-up display cut to static. Corin's throat tightened. This wasn't just an attack, it was an autopsy. "Pull back the second formation," he barked. But even as the order left his mouth, the ship shuddered violently. The Akaris had been hit. A secondary explosion tore through Deck 9. The lights flickered, bathing the bridge in an eerie pulse of red warning indicators. The comms officer twisted in his seat. "We have a breach. Multiple sections venting atmosphere. Damage control teams en route." Corin's mind raced. They needed to break free from this kill box. The enemy had set the battlefield to trap them into a slow death. Every engagement was dictated by a force they could barely see. Every move was already anticipated. And then, a voice he hadn't expected, one that made his exoskeleton feel cold. "You're losing the war, and you don't even understand how." Vaen Soral. The war veteran's face flickered onto the secondary laser plasma display, his expression unreadable, but his voice carried the weight of every battle he had ever survived. Corin turned slowly. "You. What do you want?" Vaen tilted his head slightly, the barest hint of a sardonic grin tugging at the edges of his mandibles. "I don't want anything. But if I were you, I'd stop pretending you're in control of this situation. That lie is costing you thousands of lives." Corin's temper flared, but something in Vaen's tone made him pause. It wasn't mockery, it was pity. "You knew," Corin accused, his voice low. "You knew they'd fight like this." Vaen's eyes flicked to the burning battlefield beyond the viewport. The smoldering ruins of Coalition ships scattered like carcasses in an ocean of ash. "I told them," Vaen murmured. "I told all of you, but you were too busy laughing to listen." Corin bared his teeth. "And yet here you are, watching your own people die." For the first time, something flickered across Vaen's expression, something haunted. "You think this is war?" he asked softly. "You think this is the worst they can do?" He shook his head. "This is just their opening move." Corin's grip on the console tightened, and then the battlefield changed again. A new signature flared on the sensors, a gravitational anomaly, small at first, but growing exponentially. Another weapon platform? The sensor officer's voice was tight with exhaustion. "No," Corin muttered. His eyes locked onto the readings. The humans had abandoned a portion of their own wreckage field. It looked harmless, drifting away like any other debris, but now it was accelerating. The realization struck like a hammer to the chest. They had turned entire sections of space into kinetic weapons. The Icarus's proximity alarms shrieked. "Evasive maneuvers, now!" But it was too late. A massive chunk of reinforced station hull, easily the size of a dreadnought, had been pushed into a high-speed collision course. One that only made sense now that the coalition ships had been maneuvered into position. It crashed through the fleet like a celestial guillotine. The force of impact sent the Icarus into a violent spin. On screen, the remnants of the Torvis, a ship that had once been the pride of the Coalition's advance forces, broke apart like brittle glass. Corin barely managed to stay upright as gravity stabilization struggled to compensate. He forced himself to look at Vaen. The war veteran wasn't gloating. If anything, his expression was grim. "Stop trying to fight them like an enemy you understand," Vaen said quietly. "Because you don't." The comms officer turned, voice tight. "Fleetmaster, we've lost over a third of the fleet. The retreat protocols." Corin's mind raced through every tactical play he knew, but the truth was suffocating. There was no strategy for this, because this wasn't war. This was something worse. The Icaris shuddered again. Corin exhaled slowly, steadying himself. "Get me high command," he muttered. The battle wasn't over, but the reality had shifted. They weren't fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting to escape. The Icaris limped through the chaos, its outer hull fractured, bleeding heat into the darkness. What had once been the Coalition's unstoppable spearhead now moved like a wounded beast, struggling to stay in formation as the battlefield closed in around them. Corin stood stiffly at the center of the bridge, his shoulders squared in defiance, but his fingers twitched against the console's edge. The battlefield had become unrecognizable. What was supposed to be a simple orbital incursion had turned into a maze of shifting destruction, a hunting ground where the hunters had already been decided. He inhaled deeply, the air thick with the sharp tang of overheated circuitry, and something more bitter, the unmistakable scent of war unraveling. "Status!" he barked, voice clipped. The sensor officer wiped sweat from his brow, his mandibles clicking in unease. "Surviving fleet count at 42%. We've lost contact with the Dravak's Wrath. Last recorded impact suggests a secondary reactor overload. The debris field has—" He hesitated, eyes flicking toward Corin. "Has what?" Corin demanded. The officer's throat bobbed. "Expanded. It's moving." Corin felt the weight of the words settle in his gut like a swallowed stone. He turned toward the laser plasma display, where the shifting wreckage painted a picture far more terrifying than a simple battlefield. It was shifting because someone was controlling it. He watched as entire sections of drifting debris, hundreds of dead ships, shattered outposts, and forgotten remnants of past skirmishes shifted subtly, cutting off retreat routes, funneling the Coalition's forces into tighter, deadlier pockets. It wasn't static destruction, it was strategy. Corin exhaled sharply through his teeth. They're not just using the battlefield, they're shaping it. A voice behind him made his exoskeleton itch with unease. "Now you understand." Vaen Soral stood near the edge of the bridge, arms crossed, his posture unreadable. He had been silent for the last hour, watching as the inevitability of disaster wrapped itself around the fleet like a closing fist. Corin turned to face him. How long have you known? Vaen's mandibles shifted, but his expression remained distant, like a man watching a bonfire he knew he couldn't put out. Long enough. Corin's fingers twitched against the console. And yet you said nothing. Vaen tilted his head, gaze unreadable. Would it have mattered? The bridge fell silent. Corin looked away first, his jaw clenching. The truth was bitter. It wouldn't have. A warning was useless if the ones receiving it were too proud to listen. Fleet Master. The weapons officer's voice snapped through the tense quiet. Unknown energy signatures emerging from the wreckage field, vectoring toward us at increasing speed. Corin's eyes snapped to the display. What kind of signatures? The officer hesitated. Not conventional warships. A ripple of unease slid down Corin's spine. He had learned to fear the things that weren't conventional. Visual feed. Now. The display flickered, static dancing across the screen before solidifying into an image that sent a cold weight pressing into Corin's ribs. The debris field was no longer just debris. Amid the wreckage, shapes began to move. Not fighters, not warships, something else. What the hell am I looking at? Corin murmured. The sensor officer swallowed thickly. They're using corpses. Corin's breath caught. Explain. The officer's fingers danced over the interface, pulling up zoomed-in visuals. The drones, the automated units attacking us. They're built into the hulls of dead Coalition ships. He swallowed again. Some are even using our own fallen soldiers. Corin's stomach coiled. Stripped-down remains of Coalition ships drifted forward with eerie precision, their gutted interiors now lined with human technology. Dead men, once proud warriors, reanimated as grotesque weapon platforms, their armor plated with scavenged parts, their visors glowing with cold, artificial intelligence. The battlefield had turned into a graveyard of walking ghosts. Those aren't war machines, Corin murmured, his voice tight. They're warnings. Vaen stepped beside him, his gaze locked onto the screen. They're showing you that everything you bring against them will be turned back against you. The silence on the bridge was thick with horror. Corin forced himself to swallow the revulsion rising in his throat. Can we destroy them before they reach us? That depends, Vaen said, his voice oddly quiet. Corin turned to him. On what? Vaen's eyes flickered with something deeper than fear. On whether or not you understand what's happening. Corin clenched his fists. Enough with the riddles, Vaen. If you have something to say, say it. Vaen exhaled, slow and deliberate. Then he turned to fully face Corin. You're fighting a war with tactics. They're fighting with adaptation. Every time you counter them, they change. Every time you advance, they shift. Every weapon you fire, every maneuver you attempt, it's already being calculated, repurposed, and used against you. He gestured toward the screen. Look at them. These things they are sending at you. It's not just psychological warfare, it's proof. They are proving a point, that nothing you do will matter. Corin's throat felt tight. And what point is that? Vaen's mandibles clicked softly. That you never had a war to win in the first place. Corin barely had time to register the weight of the words before the enemy finally closed in. The first wave of repurposed war husks reached the outer line of Coalition ships. Silent shapes, moving with a slowness that belied their deadliness. Then, without warning, they exploded. Shock waves slammed through the battlefield, not as weapons, but as disruption pulses. The Coalition's sensors blinked out. Entire ships plunged into darkness, and in the blackness the true attack began. Something crawled through the wreckage, fast, erratic, untraceable. Corrin's breath hitched. Full power to sensors, re-established targeting. The static on the display flickered. Then it resolved. And Corrin realized with a cold certainty that settled in his bones that he had made a mistake. The drones weren't the attack. They were the distraction. Because beyond them, something else had already arrived. And by the time they saw it, it was already too late. The first wave of blinded coalition warships drifted helplessly. Their targeting systems scrambled, their engines flickering in erratic bursts as they struggled against the unseen force that had descended upon them. Corrin's chest felt like it was being crushed under something heavier than gravity, the weight of realization. He had miscalculated. They all had. The drones had been nothing but a distraction. It was what had come after that changed everything. A shadow loomed in the debris field, moving with a cold deliberation that sent a shudder through Corrin's exoskeleton. He hadn't seen it arrive. None of them had. The void had swallowed it, masking its approach until it was already within striking distance. A vessel unlike any coalition intelligence had ever recorded. It didn't radiate power the way a battleship did. It radiated finality. Corrin's hands clenched. "Get me a full scan." The sensor officer's voice wavered. "Fleetmaster, we already did." The heads-up display shifted, casting eerie red illumination across the bridge. The readout made no sense. No known propulsion system, no discernible reactor core, no command bridge, and yet it moved. Corrin exhaled slowly, his throat dry. "It's not a ship," Vaen murmured beside him, eyes fixed on the entity drifting toward the remnants of the fleet. "It's something else." Corrin barely had time to register the words before the thing opened fire. Not plasma, not rail cannons. Something worse. A gravitational lance. Corrin felt the air shift before the attack even connected, as though the fabric of space itself recoiled. Then a coalition dreadnought, a vessel so massive it had once been described as a fortress in motion, was folded in half like wet paper. A ripple of warped light expanded outward from the impact point, and in its wake, nothing remained but a cloud of disintegrating atoms. The bridge fell into silence. Not the kind bred from fear. The kind bred from knowing fear was now irrelevant. For the first time in his life, Corrin had no orders to give. Vaen exhaled sharply beside him. "They're not just fighting you, Corrin." He turned, his voice like gravel grinding against metal. "They're erasing you." Corrin's gaze snapped toward him, his mind racing. "They want us to retreat." Vaen nodded slowly. "They could have wiped out your entire fleet by now, but they're giving you a choice." The meaning settled over Corrin like a weight too heavy to bear. Leave now or be wiped from existence. And yet, retreat was not an option. Not because of pride. Because it was too late. A transmission cut through the chaos, crackling with urgency. "Fleetmaster, the invasion force has already landed on Earth." Corrin's blood turned to ice. "They won't survive," Vaen said quietly. Corrin's voice was barely more than a whisper. "They were never supposed to." Earth surface. The first wave of coalition ground forces touched down in a storm of displaced air and thermal shock. The landing sites had been selected with care, strategic points meant to serve as forward operating bases. They had studied Earth's geography, atmosphere, and climate patterns. None of it mattered. Colonel Vexus stepped off the dropship, his armor coated in condensation from the rapid descent. He adjusted the targeting reticle on his visor, scanning the ridgeline ahead. Nothing moved. The silence was wrong. There should have been resistance. Vexus turned to his second-in-command, Commander Yorick. "Deploy scouts. I want full atmospheric readings. If they're planning an ambush, we'll crush it before it forms." Yorick saluted and signaled the recon units forward. They barely made it 100 meters before the first one vanished. No gunfire, no explosion, just gone. Yorick stiffened. "We just lost a signal." Vexus narrowed his eyes. "Lost?" The second scout stepped forward cautiously. His suit's motion trackers scanned the area, searching for anything, any sign of what had taken his squad mate. He turned back to signal. Then his body twisted violently backward. The others barely saw what happened. 1 second, he was there. The next, his armor crumpled inward like something unseen had pulled him from the inside out. And then, the screaming began. Yorick staggered back. "What is this?" Vexus's breathing sharpened. He tapped into the squad-wide frequency. "All units, engage thermal vision, now." His visor flickered. Then his stomach dropped. The valley ahead was not empty. It had never been. The terrain shifted, shapes coalescing from the haze, their outlines flickering like mirages caught between existence. Not human soldiers. Something worse. The humans had let them land. They had lured them here, to a battlefield that was alive. Vexus turned, his mouth opening to give the order. "Fall back." But before the words could leave his throat, the storm came. The entire sky shifted. The clouds twisted violently, as if something unseen had reached down and torn the atmosphere apart. The ground itself trembled beneath them. And then, from the ridgeline, the first shots rang out. Not plasma, not energy-based, bullets. But they weren't aimed at the soldiers. They were aimed at the terrain. And then, the world collapsed. Vexus felt the ground vanish beneath his feet. An entire section of the valley, hundreds of meters wide, gave way in an instant. The humans had turned the battlefield into a controlled demolition. They had let the coalition land, funneling them onto ground that had already been sabotaged, and now they were being buried alive. Vexus's last thought before the world swallowed him whole was not of strategy nor victory. It was of realization. They had never come here to fight a war. They had come here to die. Orbit Corin stood rigid, watching the battlefield below through the laser plasma display. The readouts confirmed the impossible. The invasion force was gone. Not defeated, erased, no distress signals, no emergency beacons. Just silence. Vaen exhaled, slow and even. "I warned you." Corin turned to him, something dark and heavy settling into his chest. "We're not at war with them." Vaen shook his head. "No," he said. "You're at war with the planet itself." Corin swallowed. "What do we do?" Vaen's mandibles tightened. "You don't do anything." His voice was quieter now, a whisper of certainty wrapped in finality. "You pray that they let you leave." A deep, gnawing unease settled in Corin's gut. They had stepped onto a world that refused to be conquered. He exhaled slowly, trying to ground himself in logic. "Even if we lost ground forces, we still have orbital superiority. Vaen's laughter stopped him. It was soft, but there was no humor in it. Corin turned, anger flashing through him. "What's so damn funny?" Vaen tilted his head, gaze dark. "You think you still have the upper hand?" He gestured toward the laser plasma display. "Look at your fleet, Corin. Look at what's happening." Corin frowned and turned toward the screen, then froze. The fleet wasn't in formation anymore. It wasn't because they had repositioned. It was because something was moving among them. A deep primal part of Corin's mind recoiled. It was subtle, deliberate. A warship here, drifting just slightly off course. Another, flickering with intermittent power failures. It was as if the space between them had shifted, imperceptible at first, creeping forward like a rising tide. "Sir," the comms officer whispered, "we just lost contact with the Verdun's Fury." Corin turned sharply. "Lost contact how?" The officer swallowed. "It disappeared." Corin's body locked up. "What do you mean, disappeared?" The officer's hands hovered over the console, hesitation evident in every movement. There was no explosion, no impact. One moment it was there, the next, it was gone. Silence spread across the bridge like a disease. Corin felt his pulse in his throat. This wasn't battle. This wasn't tactics or engagement or any form of warfare he recognized. The enemy wasn't fighting them. It was unmaking them. And the worst part? It had already started before they even noticed. "Recall all ships," Corin ordered, his voice low and edged with something dangerously close to fear. "Now." The comms officer nodded swiftly, fingers moving over the interface. The recall order pulsed through the fleet. But as soon as the first ships began moving to retreat, the truth revealed itself. The space between them was no longer empty. It was shifting, closing in. "Fleet Master," the sensor officer's voice cracked. "We have something on our long-range scans." Corin didn't want to look. He already knew. The heads-up display flickered, revealing the data stream. A shadow. It had always been there, lurking just beyond their perception. Not a ship, not a fleet. Something bigger. Something they had been maneuvered into without even realizing. The battlefield had never been about Earth. It had been about this, and the final move had just been played. Corin's hands felt cold. "How long have they been waiting?" Vaen's voice was quiet. "Since before you ever left your homeworld." Corin turned sharply, something like horror dawning behind his eyes. This was never a war, was it? Vaen's expression remained unreadable. "No," he murmured. "It was a lesson. A lesson written in vanishing soldiers, missing ships, and the silent, crawling dark." The last of the fleet's transmissions began flickering out, one by one. Corin inhaled sharply. Then the stars went out. Part 6. No mercy for the invaders. Darkness swallowed the fleet. Not the comforting black of deep space, where stars still whispered promises of direction and distance, but a void that devoured light itself. The heads-up displays flickered with failing data, trying to process what the sensors could not comprehend. Corin's hands tightened into fists, his claws biting into his palms. The warships that had once formed a formidable battle line now drifted like lost relics, their hulls illuminated only by the silent glow of dying energy reserves. The comms officer's voice cracked through the eerie hush. "Fleet Master, we've lost visual confirmation on 27 ships. They just—" He swallowed hard. "They just vanished." Corin didn't respond. What was there to say? Ships did not simply disappear. War did not end without battle. And yet, the enemy had just proven that both statements were false. Corin forced himself to speak. "Can we detect anything? Movement? Heat signatures?" The sensor officer's fingers moved over the console in frantic bursts. "Negative. It's like—" He hesitated, his mandibles twitching. "It's like they were never there." Corin turned slowly to Vaen. The war veteran was motionless, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the darkness like a man staring into the open jaws of something that had already decided to kill him. "What is this?" Corin demanded. "What are they doing?" Vaen exhaled, a sound that carried no relief. You thought this was a war. It's not. He gestured toward the nothingness outside the viewport. This is the cleanup. Corin's gut twisted. Cleanup. The enemy wasn't just defeating them, they were erasing the invasion. A harsh beep snapped the tension. The heads-up display flickered with an incoming transmission, but it wasn't from the Coalition. Corin's spine went rigid. Put it through. The display shifted, filling with static before resolving into an image. It was not a person, not a soldier, not a diplomat, just a black screen with a single symbol, a human sigil, not of an empire, not of a military faction. It was the emblem of Earth itself. The message came through, flat and stripped of any emotion. You came here to conquer. You are leaving with nothing. The transmission cut. Corin barely had time to react before the fleet shuddered violently. A distant explosion flared against the backdrop of nothingness, except it wasn't an attack. It was a ship trying to escape. A Coalition cruiser had attempted a blind warp jump, desperate to break free. It hadn't even made it a kilometer before something ripped it apart mid-jump. Not an explosion. Not an impact. Something had reached out and crushed it. The debris didn't even scatter. The wreckage folded inward on itself, pulled into the empty dark. It was gone. Corin's heart pounded against his ribs. We need to leave. Vaen turned to him, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his expression. You think they'll let you? Corin gritted his teeth. They sent a message. He gestured toward the screen. They didn't kill us immediately. That means there's still a way out. Vaen shook his head. You still don't get it. Corin stepped forward. Then explain it to me, damn you. Vaen's gaze locked onto his. They're not giving you a choice. They're letting you understand what it feels like to be at the mercy of something stronger. He gestured toward the void. They want you to feel this. The waiting, the silence, the helplessness. Because that's what every species you crushed felt when your fleets arrived at their worlds. Corin's mandibles clicked together. We followed doctrine. You killed without hesitation, Vaen interrupted. Now, you get to know what it's like when the universe decides you don't belong. Before Corin could respond, another alarm sliced through the silence. Another ship gone. No explosion, no debris, just absence. Corin inhaled sharply, turning back to the bridge. Emergency warp. Set coordinates outside the system. We are leaving. The helmsman hesitated. Sir, we don't know if... Do it. The bridge erupted into movement. The warp drives began cycling, energy surging through the ship's frame as calculations ran. Then, as if the enemy had been waiting for it, the darkness moved. A tremor rippled through space itself. Not an explosion, not an attack, just a shift. And suddenly, the entire fleet wasn't in the same position anymore. Corin's breath stalled. The ships had moved, not under their own power. Something had dragged them. He gripped the console, his throat tightening. They weren't in control of their own fleet anymore. The helm officer's voice cracked. Sir, the warp drive. It's not responding. Corin's mind reeled. What do you mean? The officer's eyes were wild with something past fear. It's locked. It's holding us in place. Corin's stomach dropped. They weren't being allowed to run. He turned to Vaen. The veteran exhaled through his nose. You finally understand. Corin's voice was a whisper. Understand what? Vaen's eyes flickered toward the black abyss outside. That you were never meant to leave. Then, before Corin could react, the heads-up display flickered again. Another transmission. This time, it was just 2 words. One remains. Corin's mandibles tightened. What does that mean? Vaen's gaze darkened. They're sending a message. Corin frowned. A message to who? Vaen looked at him with the quiet weight of inevitability. To everyone else. Corin's body tensed. One remains. They were going to let only one ship live. The fleet wasn't being spared. They were being culled. His mind raced through the implications. This wasn't a war. This was a warning. To every empire, every fleet, every species that had ever considered Earth a target, and they had chosen this moment to show their answer. The heads-up display pulsed again. A countdown appeared. Corin's throat tightened. The decision had already been made. The culling was about to begin. The countdown pulsed on the heads-up display. A silent executioner's drumbeat marking the final moments of the Coalition's fleet. Corin stared at the numbers, his throat tight, his mind racing. This wasn't a bombardment. There was no fleet maneuvering into formation, no hail of plasma fire raining from the sky, no declaration of victory. The humans weren't fighting anymore. They were choosing who would survive to tell the story. The transmission's message. One remains. It was not a surrender offer. It was a eulogy. Corin clenched his fists, his exoskeleton vibrating with tension. There has to be a way out. Vaen exhaled slowly, arms still crossed, expression unreadable. There was. He turned his gaze to Corin. That moment passed the second you fired your first shot. Corin's mind twisted around the possibilities. This wasn't conventional warfare. It wasn't about battle formations or reinforcement waves. The humans had planned this from the moment the first Coalition fleet crossed into their system. And that meant there was a strategy beneath it. Corin forced himself to step back from the panic. He had led fleets through planetary sieges, navigated collapsing battle lines, orchestrated years-long campaigns across hostile systems. He had to think like a commander. His voice steadied. If this were us, if we were the ones executing this operation, what would we be looking for? Vaen studied him for a long moment before speaking. Confirmation. Corin's eyes narrowed. Of what? Vaen shifted slightly, his mandibles tightening. That you understand. Corin turned toward the heads-up display. The countdown ticked lower, the silence stretching between the remaining warships. The Coalition still had hundreds of vessels in orbit. If humanity wanted, they could have ended them all in an instant. But they didn't. Instead, they waited. Corin's fingers hovered over the interface. This wasn't just execution. It was a demonstration. And every empire, every power in the galaxy would hear it. He had to make them stop. His mind raced through possibilities. What had been the humans' primary objective? Not planetary defense. They could have shattered the invasion before it even touched the ground. Not attrition. They had lost almost nothing. They didn't need to destroy the Coalition. They needed to make sure no one ever tried again. Corin exhaled sharply. He needed to convince them that the lesson had already been learned. His claws skimmed across the interface. Open a transmission. Broad spectrum. I want the humans to hear this. The comms officer hesitated. Sir, if they do it. The officer swallowed and nodded. The channel flickered to life. Corin stared into the darkness beyond the viewport, addressing the enemy he could not see but knew was listening. His voice came steady. This was not war, he said. This was a reckoning. A flicker in the transmission. They were listening. Corin continued. You gave us warning. We refused to listen. You showed restraint. We answered with arrogance. You did not fight us. His mandibles clicked slightly. tension leaking into his voice. Because you didn't have to. The countdown slowed. Corin forced himself to breathe. You have nothing to prove, he said carefully. No one will forget what happened here. No one will dare repeat this mistake. Silence stretched. Corin could feel the weight of judgment on him, though there was no response. Then the heads-up display flickered. The countdown vanished. Corin's exhale was almost shaky. Vaen's voice was quiet. You bought time. Corin turned to him, his mandibles tightening. Not enough. A new signal pulsed through the interface. Not a transmission. A single directive. One ship was being marked. A wave of cold settled in Corin's gut. One remains, Vaen murmured. Corin's hands curled against the console. The humans had made their decision. Only one ship would leave this place alive. He turned toward the viewport, staring out at the wreckage of his once mighty fleet. And then he made his decision. Corin turned to his comms officer. Transmit fleet-wide. The officer hesitated but obeyed. Corin inhaled deeply. This is Fleet Master Corin, he said, voice steel. I am ordering an immediate ceasefire. No counterattacks, no last stands, no further defiance. A ripple of stunned silence followed. He continued, each word deliberate. We lost this war before it began. What remains of our forces will not be destroyed by pride. His voice lowered. We will not waste the only chance we've been given. The fleet officers were silent. No one dared argue. Corin looked back at the screen. The human transmission was still open. They wanted a witness, Vaen murmured. Corin clenched his jaw, and they had chosen him. He turned back to the comms officer. Prepare the Icaris for withdrawal. The bridge fell into motion. Officers scrambled to reroute power to the warp drive, stabilizing systems that had been failing under the suffocating force of the unseen enemy. Corin felt the weight of hundreds of warships behind him, knowing they would not follow. Only one remained, the Icaris. Corin exhaled slowly, stepping back as the final calculations locked into place. The ship's warp drive activated. The darkness around them did not resist. The Icaris lurched forward, the stars bending, and then they were gone. Corin sat alone in his quarters, staring at the data scrolling across his personal heads-up display. The battle logs were empty, the records of the fleet wiped from the network. It was as if the Coalition's greatest military force had never existed. He leaned forward, hands clasped. No one would believe him, but they would see the wreckage. They would hear the silence. And when they asked what happened to the greatest fleet the Coalition had ever assembled, they would only have one witness left to answer. Corin inhaled sharply, letting the weight of that reality settle. Then, finally, he whispered to himself, They let me live. His jaw clenched. So I could warn the others. And somewhere, beyond the stars, he knew they were still watching. Corin sat in the darkened chamber of the Icaris, the glow of the heads-up display painting his features in shifting shadows. Data scrolled past. Battle records, fleet manifests, casualty reports. They all told the same story. A war that had never truly been fought. A lesson written in silence and absence. He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the weight behind his eyes. The Coalition's mightiest armada, erased as if it had never existed. The most disciplined military in galactic history, outmaneuvered before they even understood the battlefield. And he was the only one left to speak of it. A voice cut through the silence. You still don't get it, do you? Vaen Soral stood near the viewport, arms crossed, his posture reflecting the exhaustion that had settled deep into his bones. Corin exhaled sharply. "I understand well enough." Vaen's mandibles twitched. "Do you?" He gestured toward the laser plasma display, where the remnants of the fleet's final moments still flickered like a funeral pyre. "Because I don't think you do." Corin's jaw tightened. "Enlighten me." Vaen's gaze didn't waver. "They let you live." Corin leaned forward, resting his forearms on the console. "I know." "No," Vaen said, his voice low. "You think you know." He stepped closer, his presence heavier than the silence between them. "But tell me, Fleetmaster, if they had wanted to erase the Coalition entirely, do you really think you'd still be breathing?" Corin stared at him. Vaen continued, his words slow and deliberate. "They let you live because death wasn't the lesson." He exhaled, his voice dropping lower. "Fear was." Corin's fingers curled against the console. "They made an example of us." Vaen nodded. "And it wasn't just for the Coalition." He turned toward the viewport where the distant stars stretched in silence. "It was for everyone watching." Corin followed his gaze. The war wasn't over because it had never been a war at all. It had been a single demonstration, a message written in the destruction of the most powerful fleet ever assembled. Corin felt his throat tighten. What had they unleashed? His voice was quieter now. "You've seen it before, haven't you?" Vaen's expression darkened. "Not like this." Corin studied him. The war veteran had spent years warning them, years being mocked for his paranoia, but now there was no satisfaction in his eyes, only dread. Corin exhaled through his nose. "What do I tell them?" Vaen didn't answer immediately. He turned, his gaze cutting through the dimly lit chamber. "Tell them what you saw." His mandibles shifted. "Tell them what they refused to believe." Corin let the words settle, the gravity behind them pressing against his thoughts. Tell them. Tell them that humanity didn't fight wars. They ended them. A quiet alert pulsed through the display. The Akaris was approaching Coalition space. The remnants of his empire would be waiting, expecting a victory report. They would ask where the rest of the fleet was. They would ask why he had returned alone. And he would have to find the words to tell them that the war had never been winnable, that the enemy had never been at risk, that they had been granted mercy, not by surrender, but by irrelevance. Corin exhaled slowly, then turned his chair toward the viewport, watching the stars pass. This won't be the last time someone tries. Vaen didn't move. Number. But it'll be the last time they don't know what they're walking into. Corin's mandibles pressed together. And when they do? Vaen was silent for a moment. Then he turned toward him, his expression grim. Then there won't be survivors. The words settled like a cold weight in Corin's chest. He didn't doubt them. Not anymore. The Akaris continued forward, the only ship returning from a war that had never been fought. Corin watched the void beyond the viewport, knowing that somewhere, out in the places no fleet dared tread, humanity was still watching, waiting, not for war, but for the next mistake. And this time there would be no warning, only the silence that followed.